In this lecture, we're going to look at the special senses associated with the ear, that is, the sense of hearing, and senses of equilibrium. So we'll start by looking at the ear anatomy. So the outer ear is referred to, or the part of the outer ear, there we are. The part of the ear that we talk about as the outer ear is this section here. So the auricle is the external portions of the ear, and the auricle acts like a funnel to collect sound waves. Sound waves come as vibrations, so they're like pulses of air that propagate forward, and so the outer ear, the auricle here, can funnel those to kind of collect larger amounts of those vibrations and funnel them toward the tympanic membrane. And you can increase the effectiveness of the auricle by putting your hands behind your ear, cupping your ear a little bit, and that will gather even more of these sound waves and funnel them down the external acoustic meatus. Hopefully you learned that term. That's the tube here. Hopefully you learned that term back when we were talking about the skeletal system, toward the tympanic membrane, which is a layer of epithelial tissue that separates the outer ear. Here it is. Here's the tympanic membrane. Separates the outer ear from the middle ear. And so these pressure waves of air then cause vibrations at the tympanic membrane. By the way, the tympanic membrane is also called the eardrum, and that transfers these vibrations from being air vibrations to being bone vibrations. So we transfer them to the auditory ossicles, which are found in the middle ear. So the middle ear now is the portions of this area here that are air-filled. So this is all the middle ear here. And inside the middle ear are three auditory ossicles that are the malleus. That's the first of them in the series. The malleus, the hammer. If you learned the parts of the ear back in elementary school, you may have learned them as the hammer, the anvil. That's the incus, and the stapes. The stapes are called the stirrups because they look a little bit like stirrups on a saddle. And the function of the auditory ossicles, the bones, these ear bones, is to amplify the vibrations. So as the vibrations are transmitted from the hammer, from the malleus to the incus to the stapes, they become larger. The vibrations get a greater amplitude than they did when just the eardrum was vibrating. So maybe the eardrum vibrates, sort of out here to out here. But when the stapes vibrates, it may vibrate, that much. If we look at vibrations, the amplitude of the vibrations here, at the stapes, it is causing vibrations that are more significant, if that makes sense. And what the stapes vibrates against is a little area of membrane called the oval window. And we have a reflex, it's referred to as the tympanic reflex, which will cause contractions of the muscles that are attached to these ossicles. And they will reduce the amplification. So they will prevent the ossicles from moving as much in order to protect the oval window and the structures that are inside the inner ear. Okay, so the middle ear is an air-filled space, and it's lined with mucous membrane, as most of these the cavities of the internal cavities of the body are lined with mucous membrane, and this is where and it's connected back to the pharynx by the auditory tube. So here is a tube that drains the mucus and other secretions from the middle ear down into the pharynx, where we can give a little swallow and keep those fluids moving on out. The auditory tube was formerly known as the Eustachian tube, so Eustace has had his name stripped away. And it's the middle ear area that we get most of our ear infections are associated with. So when a doctor, when she peers into the ear and with the little light, and she is peering at the tympanic membrane and looking to see if the tympanic membrane is kind of swollen, pushed forward or pushed outward by a collection of fluids that may build up here in the space of the middle ear. And this is easy to happen because the auditory tube can get plugged up with mucus secretions if we're producing a whole bunch of mucus, like if we have a cold or some other sinus infection or whatever, and that infection is backing up into the auditory tube. Children tend to have greater occurrence of these middle ear infections because developmentally their ears, the auditory tube has a little bit shallower slope, and so into the nasopharynx here. So it's harder for the fluids to drain, and so the solution to that is to put a little tube right here in the tympanic membrane that allows drainage of fluids out the ear, so that if the auditory tube gets clogged up, then there's an alternative pathway for these fluids to move on out. Okay, so last is the inner ear. The inner ear is all of the portions of the ear that are encased in bone. So it begins at the oval window. That's where the stapes is going to cause the membrane at the oval window to flex back and forth, transferring vibrations into the fluids inside of the inner ear. The labyrinth is these interconnected chambers and tubes that are found here in the temporal bone. So this is the bone that surrounds the inner ear, or at least the osseous labyrinth is the bone, that cavity in the bone that contains the structures of the inner ear, and it's lined by a membrane that is referred to as the membranous labyrinth. So we have a bony labyrinth, and then we have this membranous labyrinth, and there is a fluid that's found between the membranous labyrinth and the bone called perilymph. So perilymph, it surrounds the membranous labyrinth, and it's kind of a buffer between the membranous labyrinth and the osseous or bony labyrinth. So inside of the membranous labyrinth, then, there is endolymph. And so that's the fluid that's inside the membranous labyrinth. And we'll talk in a minute as we look at hearing and at equilibrium, what's going on with those fluids. So enclosed inside the membranous labyrinth is a region called the vestibule. That's this area here is the vestibule. There are the semicircular, and this is also, yes, here we are. There's the vestibule. Then there's the semicircular canals. There's 1, 2, and 3. And note that the semicircular canals are all at right angles to each other, so that'll be important to make sense of in a little bit. And then there is the cochlea. So here is the organ for hearing, is the cochlea, that portion of the labyrinth. The semicircular canals are the portion of the inner ear that is responsible for equilibrium when we are moving. We talk about that as dynamic equilibrium. And here in the vestibule, we find, or this portion of the vestibule, right at the base here of the semicircular canals, are the organs that are responsible for making, for equilibrium when we are not moving, when the body is static. Okay, so let's talk first about hearing. So the membranous labyrinth that lines the cochlea. So we're looking at this spirally shaped thing here. And if we take that spiral and slice it, slice it like this, then we can see we open that up now. We can see how this spirals up to here, up to here, up to here, up to here. Okay, so the space within the cochlear duct is lined with membrane that has hair cells on it, and these hair cells are the hearing receptor cells. And there's about 16,000 of these hearing receptor cells. And on them there are these, there are short extensions that come off of them, similar to cilia, that when vibrations are transmitted through the endolymph up into the cochlea, they are deflected. So they move with the vibrations. And so these hair cells are affected by the vibrations. And we sense very low frequency vibrations. Those are the low notes. So they're vibrations that transmit further through the endolymph. And we sense those up at the tip of the cochlea, while the highest frequency notes, the high notes, are sensed by the hair cells that are found nearest the oval window. And the intermediate tones or vibrations, the intermediate wavelength vibrations, are sensed by hair cells that are found in between the two extremes. And so as the auditory ossicles then are vibrating back and forth, pumping the oval window, then pressure waves are generated in the endolymph, and the stereocilia, those projections off of the auditory receptors, they are deflected back and forth, and if there is sufficient stimulation, then different clusters of stereocilia are going to, their deflection is going to produce an action potential along an axon. And those action potentials are then transmitted up the vestibulocochlear nerve toward the auditory cortex, which is found in the temporal lobes of the brain. And then we interpret those signals as sound with, again, the high frequency notes coming from closer down here at the bottom to the opening of the cochlea, and the low frequency notes being transmitted from the very tip of the cochlea. All right, so that's hearing. But the inner ear is also responsible for equilibrium. And so the organs of static equilibrium are referred to as the utricle and the saccule. Utricle, saccule, notice that they are also oriented at right angles to each other. And they give us information about the position of the head. And so if the head is tilted forward or tilted to the right or to the left, then we get information about that, even if the body is not moving. So the utricle and the saccule each have what is referred to as a macula. The macula is like a jelly, kind of a gelatinous, gooey kind of material that has tiny little chunks of calcium carbonate. These little chunks of gravel that are referred to as otoliths. So otoliths are just crystals of calcium carbonate, and they're found embedded in this gooey, gelatinous sheet of material. And from it, or from the utricle, then, there are hair cells. Here's a hair cell with its hairs that extend upward into this gelatinous macula. In the saccule, we have, and we're going to draw the saccule here, so that the saccule has hair cells that are extending up into the macula, but it's all found, they're found tilted the macula. I'm sorry, the macula of the saccule has the hair cells projecting out horizontally. So let's take a moment then and look at what happens as we tilt the head. So the head is upright, and here the utricle is not giving any information because there's no deflection in the stereocilia of the hair cells. But when our nice lady here tilts her head forward, and I should be here, yeah. So as she tilts her head forward, we see the macula begin to sag. So the weight of the otoliths drags the macula downward, and this causes deflection in the hair cells. So notice that the hair cells have bent now. And as they bend, they produce local potential changes. And if there's sufficient stimulation, then an action potential will be generated and sent along the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. So now we get a little bit of information about why it's the vestibulocochlear nerve. It carries information from the cochlea, that's hearing, or information from the vestibule, which is about equilibrium. And so these sensations, as they arrive at the temporal portion of the temporal lobe of the brain, they are interpreted, and they are integrated then with visual information and proprioception information that's coming from the visual will be coming from the occipital lobe, and proprioception would be coming from the general sensory cortex. And so all of that information is organized, it's integrated, and it helps to give us an understanding of the position of the head relative to gravity. So if we were to take our nice lady and hang her by her toes, so we take the toes and drag them upward, and now her head is hanging downward, what we'd see is the macula here would slump in the opposite direction. And she would also be getting visual cues that would be telling her that, she's looking at people's feet now rather than their heads. And she would be getting proprioception cues that would be giving her information as well. And all of that would then be translated into an understanding of, again, the head's position relative to gravity. And so, when people get nauseated, like if they get we are not really ready to talk about car sickness yet, but if people are just standing in position, but they're really dizzy, that's because they're getting information, conflicting information, both visually and from from these organs, the utricle and the saccule, giving them information about static equilibrium. So when we get confusing information that doesn't jive properly, then that can lead to dizziness and feelings of nauseation and so on. And that can happen especially if these little otoliths break free and start rummaging around inappropriately. They can trigger hair cells when they shouldn't be triggering hair cells, and that is one cause of vertigo. It can be these otoliths, that have broken free and are inappropriately stimulating hair cells. All right, so that's static equilibrium, but we also use the inner ear to keep track of dynamic equilibrium, so the movement of the head. And if the head is moving, then frequently the body is moving as well. So if you're sitting in a car moving forward, you're going to be getting information from the semicircular canals about the forward movement of your head and the body, because the body is attached to the head. So we can sense movement in 3 different planes, and that's because of the 3 semicircular canals that are all found at right angles to each other. Notice that they sit at approximately the 3, at angles that closely approximate the 3 planes of the body. There's a frontal, let's see, am I getting these right? There's transverse and here's the frontal, transverse, and sagittal. So, and where the canals connect back to the saccule, where each one of them connects back to the saccule, so the utricle and the saccule here, there's an enlarged space called the ampulla, and here's the ampulla, and it contains an organ called the crista ampullaris, and this is where we sense dynamic equilibrium. So the crista ampullaris is a group of hair cells that have their cilia embedded again in a gelatinous mass of material called the cupola. So we have the cupola here, and we have the hairs of the hair cells that are embedded in the cupola. And this whole thing is the crista ampullaris. So as the head and the body, is because it's attached to the head, move, then perilymph in the semicircular canals is also forced to move. But and as it moves, then the cupola bends ever so slightly either forward or backward there at the base of the semicircular canal. And we get this movement because as the body begins to move forward, that that shouldn't be perilymph, that should be endolymph, I think. I'm going to have to look that up again. But you can check it yourself. I believe it's the endolymph that's inside the semicircular canals will also move. But there's a little bit of a time lag in the fluid moving compared to when the body begins to move. You kind of experience this. It's it takes a little bit as you're accelerating the car, let's say. It takes a minute for your body to accelerate as well, or not a minute, but there's a little time lag as your body accelerates. And so you feel that sensation of being pressed back into the seat. It's the same idea. As the body moves forward, the fluid is a little bit slow to react, and it presses, the fluid does, against the cupola of the crista ampullaris, and it causes deflection then of the hairs of the hair cells. And as the cupola deflects, then if there's enough bending in the stereocilia, it'll generate an action potential again along the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. And so in this way, then, the impulses are carried up to the temporal lobe of the brain for interpretation. All right, so there we have it. I believe that's everything. So if it's not, then I'll go on. But if it is, then you know what to do if you have any questions. Oh, yes, there is a little bit more then. So the job then of the cerebellum around equilibrium is to interpret all the information that's coming from the maculae of the utricle and the saccule, and from the crista ampullaris of each of the three semicircular canals, and then use that to predict the consequences of our body's movement, so that we can then get muscles contracting to maintain body position even though all that movement is occurring. So the cerebellum is busy integrating all of the information that's coming from the inner ear to make predictions, and then to send information in advance to the skeletal muscles so that we're already responding as the body is encountering whatever it's in its pathways. Okay, so now there we have it. I think that is everything there is to say. Study well.